The Nixon years have received much less study than any part of the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1975, especially in comparison with Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson years. This despite the fact that it took President Richard Nixon longer to bring the United States involvement to an end than President Lyndon Johnson spent fighting the war. It's afforded less space in most textbooks on the war, maybe a chapter, maybe two at the end. And there have been very few monographs on Nixon's policies in Vietnam. There are many reasons for this. For a long time, there have been a lot fewer documents available, and legal issues have added to the delayed release of much material from the Nixon years. Moreover, the overshadowing interest on the Nixon years have been on studies of Watergate or détente by scholars interested in that. So there are many more works on Nixon and Kissinger's overall foreign policy and détente and relations with the Soviets and China and things like that than on Vietnam, which is the exact opposite of the scholarship, for example, on the Johnson years, where there's very little on Johnson in Europe, Johnson in Latin America and things like that, but there's a lot on Johnson or Kennedy and Johnson on Vietnam. To this, one can add that the type of questions that arise during the Nixon years have not interested scholars as much in comparison to this overwhelming interest in the quest to understand the origins of the Vietnam War and the complexity of those origins, and as we've been hearing this morning, the Vietnamese side and the social, cultural, as well as the political and military. By comparison, much of the literature has looked at the Nixon years as just the inevitable winding down of a failed enterprise, or as part of a larger grand strategy of détente, as noted. This situation is beginning to change, and there are now some more people examining the Nixon years, although certainly nothing in comparison to what we were just hearing about. Right. There is now significant declassification of documents in the Nixon years occurring. When I was in the Nixon Library 2 weeks ago, walked in on Thursday morning and was told that there was a box up front that I would particularly want to look at because they had just declassified it, and it was all these telegrams between Saigon and Washington leading up to Kissinger's December visit and their efforts to try to get two back on board with the Paris peace and things like that. And so, there's thousands of documents being declassified all the time, and the move of the documents from Washington and the National Archives to the Nixon Presidential Library now, I think will increase the amount of work going on. But also, as David Anderson began this morning, the relevance of many of the issues of the Nixon years to the current concerns of American foreign policy are bringing, I think, renewed interest in the Nixon years. How do you fight a guerrilla war? How do you end a war that's in a stalemate? George Ball's famous comment to Lyndon Johnson, once on the tiger's back, you no longer get to choose when you dismount. How do you extract yourself from Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam? The post-war rise of neoconservatives as a response to the Vietnam War and their influence, obviously, in Iraq and Afghanistan. The political divisions that took root at home in the Nixon years because of the Vietnam conflict, among other things. So this makes it a good time to take stock of the historiography and what we may or may not know about Richard Nixon. Now, related directly to the theme, prior to 1968, it is actually quite striking how little work has been done on Richard Nixon and his views on Vietnam. There's no single study of his views or efforts about the war, no sustained analysis of his influence on American policy. This despite the fact that Nixon supported American aid to France, argued for American intervention during the MVM food crisis to save France, supported Diem and the ever-increasing American commitment to his regime, was an early advocate of American military intervention, and a critic, most notably in his August 1964 Reader's Digest article, Needed in Vietnam, The Will to Win, of the pace of the Democrats' escalation, and supported the war after Johnson committed troops. in 1965. Andrew Johnson's excellent book, Vietnam Second Front, ably fills some of this gap, but more work is necessary on how Nixon pushed escalation and his impact on the policy. It is well known that some of the leading Senate quote-unquote doves, such as William Fulbright and Frank Church, supported the Gulf of Tonkin resolution because of their fear of Nixon, Goldwater, the Republican right, on the presidential campaign and on the issue of losing the election to them because of Vietnam. And that President Lyndon Johnson certainly worried about another period of McCarthyism and how that crippled Harry S. Truman's second term and his efforts toward the fair deal, and did not want to see that occur to his Great Society programs. All indications of the importance of Nixon's early views and positions. Turning to Nixon and power, the Vietnam War was, as Nixon stated, problem number one, quote unquote, and the administration's actions, I believe, demonstrated this, even if the literature does not, a point I will return to. There is, however, some consensus among scholars concerning certain aspects of the Nixon years. First, contrary to early studies that came out, many of them motivated by Henry Kissinger, that Henry Kissinger was the voice of restraint to a Richard Nixon. I don't think any scholars hold to that anymore. Both Nixon and Kissinger were hawks who advocated the use of military force to resolve many problems. Second, there's consensus that there was no plan in 1968. Nixon did indeed, through Kissinger and Anna Chennault, try to interfere with Johnson's peace negotiations in 1968 by urging President Tu to resist any settlement. At the same time, he positioned himself as a moderate on the war during the campaign. His slogan, "Peace with Honor," was designed to appeal to both hawks and doves. If he wanted victory, the signal was that he was going to continue to support Saigon. If he wanted peace, the signal was he was going to negotiate. None of this, however, gave any real indication of what Nixon would do once in office. Third, there's consensus among scholars that the policy of Vietnamization was indeed central to Nixon's actions. But beyond that, as I'll note in a minute, there's no agreement on what that meant in terms of policy goals and achievements. And finally, both Nixon and Kissinger saw the negotiation process as tied to the 1972 election, even if they disagreed on the timing, and scholars do not agree on what goals Nixon had for those negotiations. Now, there's an orthodox position that Nixon and Kissinger have put out since they first took office, and that holds certain current in American political discussions, if not so much among scholars. And that is that this consistent position that they've had varies in particulars and how much credit they allot to each other, but it is similar on the main points, that they came to office bequeathed an ill-run, mismanaged, and unpopular war that nonetheless was vital to American interests and had to be properly managed. Nixon in particular understood the war as a result of a communist invasion of a sovereign nation where the United States faced an enemy that was intractable and unreasonable in its negotiations, convinced seemingly that the United States would soon quit, and that American credibility and moral standing in the world were on the line, making it essential that Washington defend Saigon and prevent a communist takeover and subsequent bloodbath that he claimed would occur should Saigon fall. Eschewing what Nixon stated was the easy and popular decision, just leave Vietnam, Nixon and Kissinger argued they saw the war through to a successful conclusion by a combination of military pressure, triangle diplomacy with the communist superpowers, and diplomatic skill, despite the opposition of Congress, the media, and the anti-war movement. The eventual fall of Saigon was the fault of Nixon's enemies who weakened him and the presidency through their attacks over Watergate and a Democratic Congress that refused to grant the necessary support that Saigon needed. So that's the Nixon-Kissinger position and those that support